Opening statements. And we're going to go this side, that side. So we're starting with the pro side on rent control. So 3 minutes per panelist. Councilmember Sawant or Nick Licata, who's starting first? Okay, Councilmember Licata is going to start first with his opening statement.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter, and thank everyone for coming out on this very warm evening. Much appreciated, and hopefully it'll be educational for all of us. Basically, what's this debate about? Those opposed to rent control say it's about allowing the marketplace to work. It will provide affordable housing. There's no need to interfere with it. Well, let's think about that premise for a moment. Is it working? I don't think so. We have a housing crisis, a crisis in which tenants are losing their homes. We have a situation here that by any rational measurement would be described as a failure to perform. The housing market is broken and it needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed because 45% of all tenants are paying rent that consumes close to a third of every dollar they bring home. That leaves money to pay for food, medicine, medical and dental care, education, transportation, and taxes. Because in this state, middle and lower wage working families pay a higher percentage of their take-home pay than the top 10%. Those opposed to rent control argue that the government can't do anything right, but that's a straw man. Like all straw men, it's easy to knock over because it's not real. No one is arguing that government-run apartments. What is real is that the housing market is already regulated, and that regulation benefits both owners and tenants. We have building codes that provide safe housing, benefiting renters. And we have a tax code that rewards private investments. Both are government interventions that work. Do we as a city become involved in having neighborhoods where long-term residents are not shoved aside? Or do we abandon them to the cold mechanics of investment decisions? The former approach results in stronger, healthier city where citizens care about each other. We watch our streets as neighbors to keep them safe for our children. The latter approach feeds an illusion of progress when in fact it is merely the construction of buildings, not the preservation of maintaining vibrant and healthy communities. That is the soul of our city. There is a public cost for losing our soul, but we can save it and still have healthy economic growth by allowing developers to continue to build and make a decent profit, but not at the cost of destroying the social fabric of our city. This is what the debate is all about.
Thank you, Nick. Okay. And next we'll have.
I'm doing it all. So I'll just stop at 3 minutes and go back.
So you get 6 minutes then.
Correct.
Okay.
We're here today because we care about the future of Seattle, a place that we love. And when it comes to housing, we have some big concerns. First, there's a deepening and widening worry that living in Seattle is becoming too expensive for hardworking people who have not seen their wages keep up with rising costs of living. Second, there is a sense that our city is growing too fast. Change is disrupting our lives. Sometimes this disruption is an inconvenience, like extra time in traffic or the noise and dust of new construction. But for the most vulnerable among us, change associated with growth isn't just an inconvenience, but what might tip a struggling family into poverty. And all this change seems to be orchestrated by a small elite made up of city officials, bankers, corporations, developers, and so-called urbanists whose vision of our city seems out of step with the rest of us. So much building going on, but little attention to the impact of growth on the lives of hardworking people in the city who are just getting by. Karl Marx sums up these feelings well, almost as well as Councilmember Sawant does, in the opening of the Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions in life and his relations with his kind. This system, Marx said, has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. I got an A in Marxism in college, by the way.
And Roger's a philosopher as well.
Right. But here's the truth. Rent control won't solve these issues, not today, not tomorrow. First of all, rent control simply doesn't deliver what it promises: lower overall housing prices. An overwhelming majority of economists agree, 93%. Rent control causes more problems than it solves. There's an overwhelming scientific consensus, just like with climate change. The rent control doesn't work. Rents go up when more people come here and demand more housing. It feels good to cap prices for housing by fiat, but rent control does nothing to produce more new housing. It creates a good situation for people who end up in the rent-controlled units, but nothing for new families who are coming here to share in our prosperity. If we were running low on bread, we'd call for a program to bake more, not impose price limits on the few loaves we have. Second, rent control isn't even legal, and while I respect and admire Councilmember Sawant's point that other important initiatives were long struggles against similar odds, let's face it, we need solutions now, today. There are people homeless in our city that will sleep in their car or in a doorway tonight. Passing resolutions asking a hostile legislature to consider an intervention that doesn't work anyway is a waste of our precious time. Creating false hope is worse than doing nothing. Third, there are many things we can do today, right now. At the Roosevelt and Beacon Hill reservoirs, we could build almost 10% of the housing called for by the HALA Committee. Using city and publicly owned land for housing is possible and doesn't require the legislature to do anything. And Councilmember Sawant and I agree that this is what we should do. Will you contact the council and mayor tonight when you go home or from your phones right now? Tell them to work with Councilmember Sawant to use bonding capacity to build housing on public land. Finally, I represent hardworking people who build and manage housing, not corporations. Most builders and landlords and contractors are small, family-owned businesses. 80% of the Rental Housing Association members operate 10 units or less. They struggle to make ends meet, and they suffer when the economy turns and demand for housing falls off. I think of the builder who almost lost an eye working out on a construction site. Fortunately, he recovered. He pays for his own health care. Builders are honest people making housing with their own sweat and risking their own money often. We're all in this together. Punishing landlords and builders won't help the family of 6 I remember from my days in a nonprofit housing organization who were living in one bedroom outside the city of Seattle, paying $850 a month. We got them in a 3-unit apartment, paying about the same in the city of Seattle. That's something we can do. That's a solution that works. It feels good to rail against corporations and pass fist-shaking resolutions or really bad legislation that only favors single-family homeowners, like the stuff that Councilmember Licata supports. But wouldn't it be better to go forward tonight together, hardworking builders, contractors, families who need housing, all of us here today, the whole city, to urge that we start building more housing now? As George Novak wrote about alienation, these economic circumstances generate unbridled individualism, egotism, and self-seeking through the bourgeois society. The members of this society, whatever their status, have to live in an atmosphere of mutual hostility rather than solidarity. We can change that. Imagine what hardworking families and builders in solidarity could do for the future of our city. We can build good housing for everyone, but rent control won't build one new unit of housing, and it won't empower us what we can do together today. It's very concerning to me that city staff only gave a hand-waving study to Councilmember Sawant's statement of legislative intent, asking them to explore using bonding capacity to build housing on publicly owned land. If every one of you writes an email and tells them to invest in further study of that proposal, it will make a difference today. It wasn't in the HALA proposal. It needs to be in there. They need to hear from you. Please do that. Both of us agree on that. It's a solution that has a lot of support. Thank you.
Councilmember Sawant, 3 minutes.
Seattle has seen a major job growth and construction boom, but very few of the new units are affordable to the majority. What about those who used to have affordable rents until recently? Times columnist Danny Westneat, who is no socialist, summed it up. He said, let's be blunt, when your landlord jacks your rate your rent's 145%, you are being kicked out. The implied message is goodbye. This is an epidemic of economic evictions. We need a comprehensive policy proposal, including making big developers pay with a linkage fee, building thousands of units of city-owned affordable housing units. So the question is not, should we do rent control and nothing else, but the question is, should we make rent control a part of a comprehensive proposal? Rent control, as we mean it, is a policy that links rents to inflation so that landlords can still make a profit, but rents are low enough that tenants aren't displaced. But let's step away for a moment from a citywide rent control policy and talk about something that might be more straightforward to most of us. I think most ordinary people would agree that it's reasonable and rational to make sure that the kind of rent hikes we've seen, 30%, 50%, 100%, 145%, should not be allowed, should not be illegal. Let's suppose we talked about a policy that said that landlords cannot raise their rents by those magnitudes. Would the real estate lobby say with us, yes, that's reasonable, let's do it? The answer is no. In fact, any reasonable or modest step to try to stop economic evictions will bring down the entire might of the real estate lobby against us. Why? Not because policies to minimize economic evictions will make a loss for them instead of profits. No, because they would still make a profit even though anti-economic evictions policies are passed. But such policies will not allow them to make runaway profits of the kind you can make only by speculative investment. They will argue trickle-down housing economics, which says you build and build and build enough of upscale units in the city, and at some point in the future, rents might come down low enough that most people can then afford housing. And then they will hope you get lost on that pipe dream while you scratch your head to figure out how in the world you're going to afford next month's rent. And meanwhile, they will be laughing their way to the bank. We don't need trickle-down economics or pipe dreams. We need affordable housing.
So, our very first question, what do you think are the main causes of the affordable housing crisis in Seattle?
All right, well, 2 minutes as to what caused the affordable housing crisis in Seattle. There's a variety. You know, I think that what's important is that we look at history, data, case studies, and stay away from ideology. You know, we want to look at real numbers and real lives and real examples, not hypotheticals or theory. What we know is that it's important to ask what causes a problem before we try to solve it. A lot of times we jump into feel-good solutions just because it feels good, but you have to understand what causes a disease before you try to go out and figure out how to solve it. So what causes the housing crisis in Seattle? There's some things that are under your control and some things that aren't. But what you'd have to look at is the fact that we have created our own problem here in Seattle. And so it's kind of interesting to watch our councilmen try to solve a problem that they created. But we drive the cost of housing in Seattle more than any other place in the country. We have killed micro-housing. You know, people came forward and said, we'll produce affordable housing for you. And the city council said, no, we're going to drive that out by creating new rules. We're going to drive costs. We're going to make it so expensive that no one would want to build more housing through land use regulations, zoning regulations, parking regulations. Seattle's one of the most regulated housing environments in the world, and as a result, it costs so much money to build housing here, either people don't do it, or if they do, they have to charge a lot to recoup those costs. And if you look at the recent HALA study, they actually concede that point. And what they say is price controls are not the solution. We need to upzone, we need to get rid of the parking regulations, we need to allow people to build grandmother apartments in the back. So the Seattle's own report says, Seattle's the problem, and we got to fix it.
Thank you, Representative. pro-rent control side, who would like to? Nick, Councilmember Licata. Councilmember Licata will answer on the pro side.
Okay.
2 minutes.
First of all, we should recognize that the affordable housing crisis is not caused by greedy landlords. Property owners' interests are not decided by personality traits. Their interests are determined by the economic system that they operate in. We have a huge gap between the demand for affordable housing and the supply for affordable housing. And that supply will never catch up to the demand. And why is that? Because the cost of borrowing, the cost of construction, the cost of land are all greater for new housing than it was for the existing housing. New construction will always have higher rents than older buildings with comparable units. Developers do not build with the goal of providing housing for the average paid worker in Seattle. They build for the highest rents that they can receive because they build to make a profit if they want to stay in business. Supply-side proponents argue that new housing will make current affordable housing on the market more affordable. Seriously? Look at what has happened last year. Tenants faced economic eviction from 327 units from current unsubsidized affordable apartments. And that was not caused by the city council. That was caused by apartment owners. Tenants were uprooted after living in their homes for over 20 years, and many had their rents doubled. What is the main cause of our affordable housing crisis in Seattle? It's not a city council that's trying to restrain a market that's out of control. It is an unfettered market that feeds speculative development and requires increasing public costs to mitigate its social and economic damage. It's time for a more rational approach. It's time for an approach that will work and that will keep tenants in their homes and not tossed off on the streets.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Licata. Roger Valdez.
I think the debate is over. Councilmember Licata said that we build housing because we get a return on investment, and if we don't get a return on investment, we won't build housing. And yet, that's exactly what he wants to do, is eliminate the profit in making housing. So it won't happen, and so he's making the point perfectly. Seattle's a beautiful, prosperous place to live. People want to live here. And we've not been keeping up with the demand for housing. In fact, the City Council, especially Councilmember Licata and Sawant, have supported policies that have reduced our capacity to produce housing. They voted for rules and regulations that have made it harder and more expensive to build housing in single-family neighborhoods, our low-rise zones, and downtown. Why, I wonder, do council members who claim to be so progressive support policies that favor wealthier people who live in single-family neighborhoods? I just don't understand that. And at the same time, outlawing microhousing and taking potential units off the market in the low-rise zones. In fact, Councilmember Licata supports measures to modify the multifamily tax exemption program that produces thousands of units so it can't be used by small efficiency dwelling unit developers and builders. Why is he doing that? Councilmember Sawant and Licata support a massive tax on housing, something that's good, that would raise housing costs and rents further. If you want to know the main causes of higher prices for housing, take a walk down the second floor of City Hall. That's where their offices are. Instead of incentivizing all new housing all over the city, the council has instead acted to protect people who already have theirs, essentially building a high wall that poor people can't climb over. The Growth Management Act mandates that our city grow sustainably, and we're not doing that. And as Councilmember Licata points out, new housing is more expensive. But the more we build of that, that takes the pressure off of the older stock that is more affordable. That's the best strategy to getting out of the problem that we have with rising housing prices. Build more housing. It's that simple.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. So Councilmember Sawant will deliver her statement.
Seattle is booming with job growth and a major influx of working people. Yes, we need increased supply. Yes, we need zoning changes to build more housing. But why is there such a severe shortage of affordable housing? And why are we losing our pre-existing stock of affordable housing, which is resulting in massive waves of displacement at a ferocious rate? Supply and demand explains why Seattle rents are going up, but supply and demand alone cannot explain why we have a wild west of skyrocketing rents. Skyrocketing rents are not an act of God. They are a form of deliberate and conscious price gouging by big real estate owners who control the market. And why are these landlords engaging in price gouging renters? The answer is pretty simple: because they can. Landlords and real estate corporations, on the whole, have disproportionately greater social and political power compared to individual renters. Wherever and whenever the real estate sector can spike up the rent, they will do as much as they can get away with. There is not a single county in the United States that does not have an affordable housing crisis, as was recently reported. And obviously, gouging happens in booming cities like Seattle, not in rural areas like Ellensburg. This opportunity to jack up rents also means that tenants living in existing buildings with affordable units experience massive rent increases, which implies economic eviction. After the tenants are driven out, the previously affordable units are renovated, sometimes even minimally, and then rented for 2 or 3 times the original rents. But gouging is not inevitable. It happens in the absence of any real protections for tenants in the form of regulation on rents. So clearly, we need rent regulations and an expansion of tenant rights.
Okay. Thank you. And now we will hear a rebuttal from Representative Manweller for 1 minute.
All right, well, I guess I would start by educating Kshama about Ellensburg. We're a town of 8,000 where 10,000 college students show up every year. So we have 18,000 people looking for housing for 8,000 people. And we did something really novel in Ellensburg. We built 10,000 additional apartments, and now we don't have a rental crisis or a housing crisis or a price crisis. And it's something you might want to consider in Seattle. Nick Licata said it exactly right. Demand is not staying up with supply. The demand is because you're successful. People want to come to Seattle. It's a great town. The economy's booming. It's a beautiful geography and climate. Where we're failing is on the supply of housing, and that's their fault. We need to allow.
Please refrain. Okay. Please refrain, or we'll give Representative Manweller another 30 seconds.
Something that's...
Okay. Representative Manweller, did you finish your statement? Okay. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, if we're going to ask rhetorical questions, I'll just conclude with one rhetorical question, and that is this. If you only had 1,000 Prius in the city of Seattle, 1,000 Priuses, right? And they were super expensive, and you came along and said, I'm going to limit how much you can sell a Prius for to $5,000. Would that create more Prius? Would that create more cars? So please, somebody on to my right, and I say that euphemistically, somebody on my right explain to me how limiting the cost of apartments will lead to more apartments. And Mr. Licata just said the problem is we don't have enough apartments. So how will limiting the price of them create more of them?
Okay, thank you, Representative Manweller. And I would ask our timekeeper to stop the clock if there are interruptions to the panelists' statements, okay? And we'll restart it. So, okay, so next we'll hear a rebuttal from the pro side.
Okay, I'll go.
1 minute. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make 2 points quickly. Roger Valdez mentioned the MFTE program. I won't go into it. Let me just say it only guarantees low rents for 12 years. The 1,000 units they're talking about are all publicly subsidized, not through the landlords, and that they've continually jacked it up so that lower and lower income people are kept out of it. Also, to answer Representative Manweller's question, there was a comprehensive review done by economists that showed that moderate rent controls without fixed price ceilings have not caused a decline in construction, capital improvements, maintenance, abandonment, or demolition of controlled relative to uncontrolled units. This is data. This is due to the non-restrictive nature of moderate controls, which, as these economists have seen, guarantee landlords a fair and reasonable rate of return. We're talking about reality here, not about fear.
Thank you. Councilmember Licata, do you have a source for that citation? Did you mention the source for that?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't hear it.
No, I mean, I did mention, but I could if you're interested.
Okay, if you have a source, I think it would be good to mention.
Yeah, it's Professor Applebaum from the University of California, based out of Santa Barbara, and the report I have a copy of.
Okay,
if you want to
thanks.
See it.
Okay, I think it's Roger's turn to rebut. 1 minute. Do you remember the question, Roger?
Well, I think we're on question 2, right?
Yeah. No, we're still on question 1. We have a ways to go. I hope you can hold out. Okay. Sir, if you're going to interrupt the debate, we'll have to ask that you be escorted out. Okay?
I don't know, maybe because it's a rent control debate.
Okay, that's the second warning, so next time we're going to get escorted out. Okay? Okay, Roger.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to point out is that we have built over a 20-year period 40,000 new housing units. Only 5,000 housing units have been demolished to make room for those 40,000 units. And of those 5,000 units that were demolished based on DPD data, none of those were subsidized tax credit units or subsidized units through covenant. They could be single-family homes to make way for, in a low-rise zone, to make way for a micro-housing project or for apartments. So we're not, there's a myth out there that all the new construction that you're seeing is wiping out a bunch of affordable housing. For the vast majority of those 40,000 units were built on parking lots, vacant lots, or small, and maybe knocking down something that was past its prime anyway. So don't buy that argument that there's a lot of that going on.
Thank you, Roger. All right. Thank you. Councilmember Sawant.
So there was a reference made that the mayor's Housing Affordability and Livability Advisory Task Force did not recommend rent control, and so that's why we should not be discussing this. Let's remember that committee is half full of developer lobbyists, and yet the committee internally voted 13-11 in favor of exploring rent regulations, but it did not make the final cut of recommendations because they want consensus. But I submit to you, how can you have consensus when you have two groups whose interests are completely opposite to each other? Landlords who want to maximize profits at every cost, and tenants and tenant advocates who want to make housing affordable. And if you have that situation, you're not going to have rent control. The fact that we have 700 to 800 people here eagerly wanting to hear about rent control, facing skyrocketing rents, tells me that this is a valid debate to have. And by the way, only in 2008, the voters in California, with a whopping majority of 61%, voted to keep rent control in the state of California.
Thank you. Okay, I believe that concludes the statements and rebuttals for question 1. We will now move on to question 2. What have been the effects, positive or negative, of rent control where it has been adopted?
Okay. There are clearly two positive effects regulating rents. First, they will help middle and lower income people remain in Seattle, where they're closer to their jobs, resulting in less time they spend in traffic congestion and more time to be with their families. Second, rent control stops sudden rent hikes that can create a frenzy for new speculative development, often leading to housing bubbles, as we've seen in the past. Opponents of rent control make the following claims. First, it will lead to apartment buildings being abandoned. However, a Columbia University study concluded that substantial evidence Available from national as well as local studies suggest that there is no correlation between rent control and abandonment. Abandoned buildings occur at similar rates in cities with rent stabilization as those without it. The second claim made is that vacancy rates will rise with rent regulations. After Boston got rid of its rent regulations, the vacancy rate got even smaller. It fell to 2.9% from 4% under rent stabilization. New York, a city with 1 million rent-subsidized units, consistently has vacancy rates lower than the rest of the country. The final argument they make is that new construction will slow. A New Jersey study done after multifamily housing construction dropped 77% in the nation during a downturn found that the reduction in New Jersey cities with rent regulations had only a 52% drop. We have too often faced charges about why we can't even discuss rent control, let alone even try to attempt to put it in place or regulate rents. It's time to start looking at how it actually works in other cities. And many, many times it does work, and we need to get the word out. So.
Okay. Representative Manweller.
Thank you. I'm going to tell you what will happen, what's happened with rent control based on what has already happened. One, you will get a reduction of the housing stock. In San Francisco, which currently adopted rent control, for every 10 low-income housing units that the city is building, they are losing 8 rent-controlled apartments. They're literally just turning them into condos, commercial buildings, or just sales. For every step forward they take, they're losing one. Okay? The St. John study of 1993 showed that when they instituted rent control in Berkeley, they lost 14% of their housing stock. When they did it in Santa Monica, they lost 8% of their housing stock. When they did it in New York, they lost housing stock. So every city that's ever done this has lost housing, and particularly low-income housing. 2, it does create dilapidated housing. A little bit of a straw man argument by using abandoned housing. In New York, between 1960 and 1967, when rent control was adopted, the percent of housing growth was 2%, but the amount of dilapidated housing grew by 44%, and the amount of deteriorating housing grew by 37%. No one can afford to replace the carpets, repaint, add new utilities when rents are capped. So what you get is boarded up, broken window, lead paint, unsafe housing. We know it's happened because we've documented it. 3, you lose your tax base. I'd be very remiss if I didn't point out the Heffley study of 1998, the Navarro study of 1985, and the Glazer study of 2002 all showed that the cities that adopted rent control, their tax base fell, their schools suffered, their parks suffered, their hospitals suffered, all their social services suffered. When you're not building housing, you're not paying housing taxes, and when you're not paying housing taxes, your teachers and your schools suffer. Don't do it.
Councilmember Sawant.
So I think if we are willing to look at this rationally and not look at the voodoo science, but the actual statistics, then we'll see that, one example, according to the New York City 1996 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the average income of rent-stabilized households is only $21,600 per year, meaning it is actually serving low-income and middle-income people because they're the ones who are, that majority that lies below that median needs help. And there's also another logic here. You know how they've done this in public education where there's more and more and more defunding of public education. Schools can't work without the necessary funding, and then we are told, oh, wait a minute, public education doesn't work. The same logic has been used to weaken rent control and rent stabilization policies. One very concrete example, in San Francisco, the rent control program was working really well, but it was weakened by a statewide measure called the Costa-Hawkins Act, which passed something called vacancy decontrol, which means that if a current tenant in a rent-controlled unit leaves or passes away, then that unit reverts to the market, which means that over time, a lot of the rent-controlled units have been phased out into the market, which means that we don't actually have that much rent-controlled units, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that strategy is used over and over again to undermine good progressive legislation. And as far as unsafe housing is concerned, you know what? We have a lot of unsafe housing right now in Seattle. We have slumlordism in Seattle, and the reason it happens. Well, clearly we don't have rent control here, so there shouldn't be any slumlords, right? But the reason it happens is because of the disproportionate power that landlords and real estate corporations have, that individual renters cannot exercise their rights. That is why we need expansion of tenant rights and rent control.
And we'll now hear from Mr. Valdez on the anti-rent control side. And again, the question for all of you and for the televised program is, what have been the effects, positive or negative, of rent control where it has been adopted elsewhere?
So I quote Karl Marx, and Councilmember Sawant mentions God and voodoo, so something's happening that's important. I got an email out of the blue from a guy in Stockholm, from Australia, who's living in Stockholm. And he sent me a bunch of stuff, but one of the things he sent me was a map. And this is, you're not going to be able to see it, but it's online. It's posted on our smartgrowthseattle.org website. This map shows the waiting time in Stockholm for rent-controlled units. So what happens is you disincentivize new construction. You create problems with the ability to operate buildings, as Councilmember Licata points out. You're creating a downward pressure on what can be taken away in rents. Meanwhile, Mike Scott from Dupree Scott has a graph that shows that operating costs, including taxes, are increasing faster than rent increases. As much as people say rent is skyrocketing, the cost to operate the buildings is going up faster over time. So what's happening is you're going to have Councilmember Sawant and Licata trying to do something they can't do anyway, wasting all of our time arguing about something that's illegal. And then even if they did it, what they'd be doing is pushing downward pressure on revenue at a time when costs are going up, and they want to tax new housing, they want to tax everything else, and then they want to take away the ability to pay those taxes by lowering the ability to have the rents keep up with it. It is essentially a strategy that will cause housing in Seattle. You think it's skyrocketing now? You think it's bad now? Let Councilmember Sawant and Licata have a crack at running the housing market. And you talk about voodoo, you will need, stop the clock. You can cheer all you want, but the legislature is not going to let this happen. And even if they did, it won't work, and it's not going to make anything better except for people that own single-family homes.
Okay, thank you. I have to commend our panelists at this stage for sticking with the time. And let's continue with the rebuttals now. We have 1 minute each for 4 minutes of rebuttal, starting with Councilmember Licata.
I'd like to begin by thanking Roger for agreeing that we should have a crack at rent control in Seattle. Thank you. You know, the argument that costs are going up and that's what's driving the rent increases is not realistic. Look at what the Seattle Times business reporter Sanjay Bhatt just recently wrote when he noticed that rents were increasing 4 times the rate of inflation. Operating costs are not increasing 4 times the rate of inflation. Operating costs are basically, only place they're going up is where you may have new construction and you have a lot of fancy clubs there, swimming pools, whatever. The argument that you're losing housing is, as Councilmember Sawant mentioned, is because the laws were changed that a lot of the controlled units were forced to basically turn over. If you have a moderate rent control in place, you will save units and you will keep overall costs low.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Representative Manweller?
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, the data suggests that neither one of those things will happen. Here is from the San Francisco housing study published this month after they adopted rent control. It says, quote, neighborhoods like Richmond, Sunset, and the Castro District have seen significant drops in overall units as they have barely added any in the past decade. This is from the San Francisco supervisors who passed the law. They conclude, it now costs between $600,000 and $750,000 to build one unit in San Francisco. What do you think the rent is going to be on an apartment that costs $750,000 to build? This is what these people have given you to the right. In contrast, he talks about Boston. When Boston eliminated its rent control, it saw an investment and housing boom of 20% over the current stock. So we know time after time, rent control reduces the stock, jacks up the prices. Why would you want less housing that's more expensive?
Okay. Councilmember Sawant, 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, first of all, the rents are rising at a higher rate in Seattle, and we don't have rent control. San Francisco does. So, you know, what logical conclusion would you have? That does rent control lead to high prices or higher rates, or does the absence of rent control lead to that? And all the neighborhoods that Representative Manweller mentioned in San Francisco, they are all, specifically, all those neighborhoods he mentioned are experiencing rent increase precisely because of the loophole of the Costa-Hawkins Act statewide, which carries out vacancy decontrol. So really, it's the loopholes in rent control that have caused these problems, so which means that we need strong rent control laws. And as far as the question of new construction is concerned, in New York, we saw the biggest housing booms happen during periods when they had the most stringent rent control measures. Growth has nothing to do with rent control. Growth has everything to do with capitalism, whether capitalism is going through a boom period or a bust period. These are macroeconomic factors. Localized factors like minimum wage, rent control have no impact on it.
Okay. Mr. Valdez, you get the last word on the rebuttal.
So this is how this debate goes in this city. Sanjay Bhatt, who is a newspaper reporter, is cited as a real estate expert, while Mike Scott, who has been doing this for 30-plus years, is just dismissed out of hand. The fact is that operating costs are rising faster than rents. They are. It's a fact. And you can sit there and wave your hands and deny it all you want. That is what's happening. If you get your way, you will squash that down even further. And it's not a question of landlords letting I saw somebody tweeting about, oh, landlords will just become slackers and not repair their buildings. That's not what happens. They won't have the money to be able to fix the buildings because Councilmember Sawant and Licata will take away the revenue source that they can. And at the same, stop it. Did you listen to what I said? Did you listen to what I said earlier? Obviously not. So,
okay.
Let me finish, because he disrupted me.
Yeah, I know.
My point is that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy that is dictated by the council, where they do things to lower housing supply, prices go up, and then they say prices are skyrocketing, we need rent control. That's bad policy, bad politics, and bad for all of us in this city.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Okay. We're on to question 3 now. Question 3. Without rent control, can the market make housing affordable in Seattle? Without rent control, can the market make housing affordable in Seattle? And we'll start with the anti-rent control on my left. Who'd like to start? 2 minutes.
Well, it already does. As I pointed out, there are currently 4,369 affordable units in existence today that leverage the multifamily tax exemption program that grants a property tax exemption to housing projects that set aside at least 20% of their units for affordable housing between 60 and 80. That's a higher inclusion than any other proposed inclusion program that's ever been proposed in the city. Right now, it's working. There are people living in those units right now. The total annual cost of that program in deferred property tax is $3.6 million. cost the city about $900 a unit on average to lock up those and restrict the rents in those units. And the cost overall is about $1,204,000, which is about $10 per median priced house, single family house in Seattle. That means a single family owner is paying $10 a year so that somebody gets a rent-restricted rent in multifamily tax-exempt buildings. The program does need work. We need to find a way so it can support landlords who are struggling to make repairs that otherwise they'd have to increase their rents to do. We need to find ways to expand the program. But why is Councilmember Licata was trying to scuttle the program by lowering the percentage of and raising barriers of entry so builders can't take advantage of it? This just doesn't make any sense. We also produced microhousing, which was incredibly affordable and incredibly efficient. And why anybody would hiss, I live in one of these. Many people live in them. It's just bizarre that Councilmember Sawant and Licata would campaign to destroy a product that affordably houses thousands of people in the city. It makes no sense. So we have the opportunity to do these things. The market can be leveraged to create affordable housing, and it already does.
Thank you. Speaker number 2 on our pro-rent control side. You want me to restate the question?
No, that's
okay.
Unless you want to.
What can we do? I'll just restate it again. Okay. What can the market do? What can the market do without rent controls to make housing affordable in Seattle?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
As I stated before, the unrestrained market, sometimes referred to as the free market, cannot by itself provide affordable housing unless you consider housing found in slums. But if the slums of Rio de Janeiro, for instance, or Cape Town are models of the free market providing affordable housing, then I think they have a marketing problem. Here in the U.S., no city has relied solely on the marketplace for providing decent, affordable housing for its residents. And I'm talking about major cities. I'm not sure what happens with very small ones. So if we do influence the marketplace to provide it without some form of rent regulations, 2 efforts come to mind. We can use inclusionary zoning or linkage fees. We need inclusionary zoning that would require developers to include affordable housing within new projects or contribute funds for building affordable housing elsewhere. No public funds are provided to the developers. However, in exchange for this obligation, their properties benefit by being upzoned, resulting in higher resale value for those properties. The Mayor's Housing Affordability Committee, referred to as HALA, recommended inclusionary zoning by upzoning a major portion of the city. However, this legislation is not expected to really come into fruition for at least another 2 years. And they're not talking about using inclusionary zoning on residential, which they can be doing almost immediately. We were supposed to do it in South Lake Union, and it didn't really occur there. We can also enact those development fees now, as the council had originally planned. So I say stick to original plan and apply particularly residential linkage fees to developments as soon as possible.
Okay, speaker number 3, Representative Manweller.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to answer this question by telling a story that history provides, because every once in a while history provides us with a great case study which we can see what works and what doesn't. Following World War II in New York, millions of servicemen had to return. They were abroad, they were in Europe, they were in Japan, and they all came back, and of course there was no housing for them. And 2 different approaches were taken. In the city of New York, they said, we're going to establish rent control. And what they got was the fall of housing, dilapidated housing, arson actually, because people actually burned their apartments for the insurance money. It was a disaster. But just across the city lines, they created something called Levittown. And a group of free marketeer, private guys said, we are going to build thousands and thousands of homes for these returning GIs. There was no land use regulations, there were no parking restrictions, there was no city council telling them what to do. And in a matter of 2 years, Levittown produced enough housing to house every returning soldier, and they did it by actually creating houses that was nicer than the apartments in New York, and they made it so that it was cheaper to buy a house than it was to rent an apartment. Think about that. Millions of servicemen returning. New York goes with the command and control structure and creates more homelessness and dilapidated housing. The free market says we will build thousands of homes for these returning soldiers, and they all got bigger homes, nicer homes, and they did it cheaper than renting an apartment. That's an amazing thing. We had that opportunity. So let's talk to the booers and hissers. Ooh, yeah. Okay, we talk about apartments. Boo, hiss. As if somehow because you don't want to live there, no one else should be allowed to live there. What absolute government arrogance. Because I don't like something, no one else should have it. If that was the rule, there would be no mayonnaise, because I hate it, okay? So just because you don't want to live there doesn't mean that thousands of other people do want to live there. We should get out of their way and let them.
Councilmember Sawant, you get the
Well, I
final
don't
statement
necessarily
here.
think microhousing is evil, but it is actually per square foot extremely expensive. It's not affordable. And also, microhousing is not a solution for households that want to raise children in this city. We want this to be a livable city. And please don't interrupt me. And it is certainly not a solution to the problem of our people of color communities that are fast being displaced from our city. They're not able to live here. Please let me finish. We obviously need a comprehensive housing program. I support the Hollow recommendations. I don't think they go far enough. We do need city-owned housing, thousands of units of affordable units of them. We need linkage fees on big developers. We need to expand tenant rights. But without rent control being part of that mix of comprehensive policies, there is really no answer to the fact that rents are skyrocketing today. The market units that are on the market that are affordable today, tomorrow will be flipped into unaffordable because you'll get a letter in the mail from your landlord saying your rent has gone up by 100 or 125%. To prevent that, rent control or rent regulation is the only policy that works. And as far as other policies are concerned, we're being told by the other side that, this is a fantasy land, let's talk about what happens today. Well, linkage fees, a robust linkage fee without a phase-in is a policy that we can pass today to make big developers pay. I would urge Mr. Valdez to support me in that. Maybe we can make it happen. And as far as this idea of trickle down, I mean, trickle down economics has been so thoroughly discredited. I mean, if you're on planet reality, then it has been thoroughly discredited because it's shown not to work. And even planners in New York have admitted increasing supply by itself does not help. Upzoning by itself does not help. All those policies have to be combined with rent regulation.
Okay, we're going to have a round of 1-minute rebuttals on this question about what can the market do to make housing affordable in Seattle.
So, this business of it's per square foot more expensive is really a canard. The fact is that some people don't want as much space as a 5,000 square foot house. Can you stop it?
Please don't interrupt the speakers.
Okay, Roger, you can continue.
Not everybody wants to live in a 900 square foot apartment in Burien, Kent, or West Seattle. So many people make the choice to live in a smaller apartment, to buy less square footage, so that they can live affordably next to people that are paying far more for bigger apartments and rents in places like Capitol Hill and Ballard. It's a choice, and it's an affordable choice, and the market created it. Now, you talk about sort of studied, deliberate, willful, determined denial of economic reality when you have a council that does things to make it harder and more expensive to produce housing with one hand, and then with the other hand tries to impose rent control and tries to do things that, because the rents are skyrocketing. Why are they doing that? Because of the policies you're making.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Licata, 1 minute rebuttal.
Yes, we seem to have dragged in the MFTE a lot in this discussion because it's such a program that really doesn't meet the housing crisis. It has basically a lot of units that are produced for a very short period of time, and the subsidy they're receiving from the public, I don't believe is worth it, because most of these units, in fact, are literally dollars above what you can buy in the neighborhood, since the costs that they're rewarded on are based on new construction, not the existing structure. As far as New York City after the World War, that was rent control with a ceiling. There's no rent control now in the country that we know of, that's major at least, that has any kind of ceiling on the prices. They all basically are moderated to take into account a reasonable rate of return in exchange for not gouging renters. And finally, where's this no, I haven't heard the opposition talk about the need for linkage fees and how they could be used. If their concern was, in fact, to provide more housing and not have rent control, why don't they discuss about having linkage fees?
Representative Manweller.
Well, thank you. I'm going to focus on two issues because we only have a minute. One, the issue was raised is what's the effect on children? I'm glad that issue was raised because there have been multiple studies of the effect on rent control on children, and it's devastating. Because what rent control does, yes.
Can we keep it quiet, please, or we'll give him extra 10 seconds?
Listen, you might learn something.
Okay.
So rent control denies mobility. Hey, heckling can go both ways, and I'm better at it.
Just stop the clock.
All right.
Okay, we restarted
Here's
the clock.
what rent control does. It decreases mobility. You move into a rent-controlled apartment at $700, you're just married, and then you say, hey, let's have a kid. And you're like, wow, we're a little crowded here, but you can't move. You're like, whoa, we don't want to give up this apartment. Then you have another kid, and you're like, well, should we move? We've got 4 people in this 1-bedroom or studio apartment. Like, no, we can't move because we'd give up this rent-control apartment. So what they did is they found in Santa Monica and Berkeley and New York is they would go into these houses and there would be 6 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment, and they'd say, why are you doing this? And they're like, I can't move. Blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
Okay.
Stop the clock. Okay. We're stopping the clock again. Please let the representative finish his statement. He has 30 seconds to go. Okay. Save it for later, please. Save it for later.
I'm going to speak to rent control because that was the topic of the debate. So the second issue was, Sawant mentioned that if you don't have rent control, you're going to get this nasty letter that says your rent's doubling. Here's what we know does happen when you establish rent control. You get a nasty letter from your landlord that says, your apartment isn't an apartment anymore. It's a condo. Get out. I'm going to sell it. Because as a rental, it's capped. But as a sale, it's not. So see this 10-unit apartment complex? It's now a 10-unit condo complex, and I'm going to sell them for $200,000-$300,000. That's what happens every place we've ever adopted rent control. You don't want one of those letters.
Okay. Okay. Rebuttals. We have one more rebuttal. Councilmember Sawant.
Well, right now, people with children, families with children, are being forced to move out of Seattle. The impact has been the hardest on the black community and people of color and low-income people, but now it's happening to middle-class people as well. And as far as this whole thing about condos and apartments, to my knowledge, most of the apartments that are being renovated are still being rented out because you can charge sky-high rents when you flip them in the market. But I wanted to say something else here. A very common tactic used by the real estate lobby to prevent any kind of eviction protection for renters, including rent control, but not just rent control, is to use their funds, their money, and they funnel that into conservative candidates, conservative politicians in rural areas which don't need rent control. The rural areas of Eastern Washington don't need rent control. Seattle needs rent control. But the way they control the process in Seattle is by flooding their campaigns with cash and controlling it at the state state level. And the only way we will be able to counter this for Seattle's protection is to build a mass momentum here.
Okay, we are, like the enthusiasm in the room, keep it respectful, as I've said. What do you think will be the impact if rent control is adopted in Seattle? What do you think will be the impact if rent control is adopted in Seattle? We'll start with the pro statement. And will that be Mr. Councilmember Licata?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, when most people think of rent control, they think of New York City or San Francisco, and those examples have been used again and again on the opposition side. But in fact, there are 200 cities in the U.S. that have some form of rent regulation. And each city has tailored their ordinances to fit their housing markets. And that's what we would do in Seattle. You don't choose examples that are 100 years old. You basically look around what works throughout the country. Asking what kind of rent control will Seattle have is like asking what's the impact of a sunny day on Seattle. You don't know for sure, but you know it's going to be good. Because it opens up new possibilities, and that's what rent control would do. We know that the multitude of data-driven studies that the predictions of catastrophic economic calamities are untrue. We know for sure that some people will be able to live in Seattle because of being guaranteed affordable rent, rather than seeing particularly the minority community being pushed out. The census in 2010 showed that in the central area, 54% of the residents there were African American. And now 10 years later, it's 24%. It's because they couldn't afford, in many cases, the increased rents. We need to lift the ban from the city, the current rental control ban. Because as it's enforced now, any type of restraint over rent prices, not a ceiling, just even an advance warning that there's going to be a rent increase, are considered a type of rent control. They should not be beyond the reach of a democratic decision-making process. The citizens in the city should have the right to decide if they want to have their own local government make some decision about how they can remain in the city and how rents should be regulated. I think it's a question of small local government fighting off big government that's under the influence of big, major political contributions. Thank you.
All right, we'll hear from Mr. Valdez.
You
next.
want to come to planet reality? If we controlled with political money the city council, neither of you would be sitting here right now. Okay? We don't. We don't. Secondly, what I find ironic about Councilmember Licata's statement is he'd rather have the poor, provided that the rich were less rich. That's his policy. That's his attitude. That's what he wants to do. He wants to penalize.
Please, no shout-outs, and let Mr. Valdez finish.
He wants to penalize and punish, not create new housing units. That's why he's campaigning against the multifamily tax exemption. That is going to be a legacy that he has left as he's ruining it. Why? Because somebody gets a little bit of a tax break that, by the way, includes the renter that gets to live in a rent-restricted unit. But that's not good enough for Councilmember Licata. He wants to take money out of the pocket of the private developer. And so he's more concerned. Stop the clock. Stop the clock. Stop the clock for a second.
Okay. Take a breath.
So what Councilmembers Sawant and Licata and the council want to do is they want to raid sort of the private sector and grab a whole bunch of money from there, which will result in higher housing prices, and then give it through an inefficient system that is managed by, Seattle government, which you, by the way, don't trust because Councilmember Sawant says it's controlled by the corporations. So she's going to grab that money, he's going to grab that money, and give it to that corrupt government to redistribute to all of you. That's what they're talking about doing. So that's planet reality. Come there with me, and let's build more housing together so that we can solve this problem and stop trying to vilify people that are working hard to do a good thing, which is build more housing for this city.
Councilmember Sawant, 2 minutes.
So I think we are in agreement that it's not just about rent control. We need a whole host of progressive policies to be passed in the city of Seattle to address the serious income, wealth, and racial inequality that we have prevailing in our city. So first of all, as I said before, we need a comprehensive housing program. Rent control needs to be part of that program. We need to expand tenant rights. And we also need a citywide millionaire tax so we can fund mass transit and public education. And what would we get out of this comprehensive package of progressive policies? We would get what I presume many of us want, which is a culturally vibrant and racially diverse community of a city that would really provide a wonderful atmosphere for the younger generation to grow up in. It will enable a reversal of the exodus that we see right now of working families, especially of the Black community, especially of young people starting out in life, and senior citizens on fixed income. So if our vision of the city is to provide a dynamic, vibrant, and humane place where everybody can thrive, then we need all of these policies, including rent control. But we're not going to get any of this unless we understand that just like the $15 an hour victory, this is going to come to us only if we build a sustained and strong mass momentum on the ground, a grassroots movement, and particularly to fight against loopholes. California right now is fighting against Costa-Hawkins Act, which is a major loophole in rent control there. We need to make sure that when we win these policies here, we win them without the loopholes. And that is why I would really appeal to everybody, support Councilmember Licata and me in our resolution to demand that Olympia repeal the ban on rent control so that Seattle has a fair chance, a real shot at fighting for rent control.
Okay, let's hear from our final speaker on the anti-rent control side. The question again is, what will be the impact if rent control is adopted in Seattle? Representative Manweller.
Thank
2
you.
minutes.
Let's quickly go through the ones that we've already covered. So what we know will happen based on history, case study, and data is there will be no new investment in housing. Rent-controlled housing will dilapidate and you will get rundown housing. You may actually see the drop in housing as you will see the conversion of rentals to condos, office space, and retail space. The tax base will shrink. You will see less money for your schools, your parks, your social services, your mental health, and your health care, and it will be less attractive to new businesses to come here. But let's also take a moment to talk about things that we haven't talked about. The issue of race came up, and I'd like to talk to you about how rent control actually accelerates gentrification. According to Berkeley socialist sociologist John St. John, he notes in the 1994 Boston-Cambridge study, the apartments of rent control were concentrated among the highly educated white professionals, while the poor, the elderly, and the students were generally excluded. Rent control has actually accelerated gentrification in Berkeley and Santa Monica, St. John said. Poor and working class have been forced out of these communities faster than the surrounding areas. That is from a socialist sociologist who works at Berkeley. He's telling you, you adopt rent control, it increases gentrification, and people of color get driven out of your community. It becomes less diverse, more homogeneous, more wealthy, more white, more highly educated. Please tell me that is not the, quote, values of Seattle. You asked for citations, I'll provide the citation and the case, okay? And the last thing I'd mention is black markets. The reason that you get gentrification is when apartments are capped at, say, $1,000 and 400 people show up to him. What the landlord does is, who's going to pay me a $10,000 finder's fee? And what happens is you get a black market where the wealthy person says, I'll give you $10,000 under the table if you give it to me. That's what happens.
Okay. Okay, I believe we're on to the 1-minute rebuttals now, and we'll start with Councilmember Licata or Sawant. 1 minute.
I'll begin, that's fine.
Okay.
You know, the argument against rent control, is, from what I'm hearing from the other side, is that all these bad things will happen. The locusts will arrive. You know, there have been condo conversions in Seattle since I've been on the city council in '98. In fact, in '98 and '99 and 2000, many, many buildings were converted into condos, were apartment buildings. We didn't have rent control. There have been people, there have been families moving out of the city because they couldn't afford rents. There is no rent control there. Their solution is basically, we'll just build more. They said that. And it's funny, they quoted Mike Scott. Mike Scott pointed out that we're at a record pace right now of apartment construction. Some 8,400 units will be open in King County and Snohomish counties this year, and over 11,000 next year. And that is skewing the average rent higher, said local apartment expert Mike Scott. Because what's happening is that the existing units, the owners are charging more because they can see the new owners are getting more on their apartment units. That's why you need to regulate the market.
Representative Manweller or
Okay.
Mr. Valdez?
We can go out of order, that's fine. 1 minute rebuttal. I would say this. Not one thing that I have cited tonight talks about what will happen. I have only cited things that have already happened. This has not been a debate about the hypothetical. Every study that I have cited, every study that I have brought, was publicly funded by very liberal municipalities, not a dime of corporate money, not a dime of lobbyist money. Mostly left-of-center academics from very blue cities have universally said rent control in our city is a failure. And if rent control is such a success, then why is it that in most of the places it was adopted, measures were taken to not only ban it then, but to ban it in the future as well? I will conclude with the way we started. There is a greater scientific consensus that rent control is harmful than there is a scientific consensus that climate change is man-made. If you believe in one, you have to believe. Can I have an extra 5 seconds?
5 seconds more.
Yes. If you are not an intellectual hypocrite and you say, let's follow the science, there is a greater level of scientific consensus about the harms of rent control than there is climate change. You can't have it both ways. You gotta be consistent.
Thank you. Councilmember Sawant, 1 minute. Please, no interruptions.
Well, you know, massive gentrification is happening now. The black community is being driven out now, and we don't have rent control, so I'm not sure how the logic flows. And as far as a sociologist, I don't know what that study is, but maybe when he says socialist, he means libertarian. And as far as these apocalyptic scenarios are concerned, you know, the saying that black people will be the ones to suffer the most with rent control is the same as big business saying when we were fighting for 15 that if you win 15, it would hurt the lowest paid workers the most. But in reality, it helps the lowest paid workers the most. And in fact, no big business, no small business has collapsed. In fact, businesses are opening more of their restaurants. Tom Douglas just opened a new restaurant. You know, he was one of the loudest opponents of $15 an hour. So we will see these Chicken Little stories over and over again every time we fight for a progressive policy. Let's wait till we fight for a citywide millionaire tax. We will hear about how that is going to cause an apocalypse in Seattle. But in reality, these policies help working people.
Okay, thank you. Roger, 1 minute.
I'm going to go back to the point. We talk about what's going on right now. What's going on right now is there are 30,000 rent-restricted units already today in Seattle. There are people living in them of all levels of income, from 0 income to 60% income, and even higher in the multifamily tax exemption units. These are all units that were built like the project I built when I was a nonprofit housing developer, using low-income housing tax credits and using housing trust fund money. And the deal is that when you build that kind of housing, you make a promise that you're not going to raise the rents. And that has produced thousands upon thousands of really great housing units in this city. But what the council members want to do is they want to impose that in a way that's going to create higher costs for everybody else. And the point is, why are we not finding ways to collaboratively increase funding for the Housing Trust Fund, find other sources of revenue like the levy, to make more of those kinds of units?
Okay. Okay, we're doing really well, you guys. Thank you. And we're almost through with the program here, but we now are moving on to closing statements. And we're allowing 3 minutes for each panelist to make a final closing statement. There will be no rebuttals to the closing statements, obviously. And then we'll conclude with some brief acknowledgments. And so to begin with, we'll start with the anti-rent control panelists. Will that be Mr. Valdez? We've kind of gotten back and forth.
So we
here,
go three and three, back and forth?
Yeah, we'll switch back and forth here. So 3 minutes.
So just to, in my vision of Seattle and what I want to see is I want to see a Seattle where a young couple with a family might be driving their car with the red tape on the taillight and maybe have the last tank of gas, and they're coming here to take a job that perhaps a $15 an hour minimum wage job. I want them to be able to sell that car for their first month's down payment in a house close to transit or in an apartment close to transit. And I want them to be able to thrive in this city. Because I'll tell you what, if we don't have those people and we don't have that diversity, we cannot be a great city. The city of Alexandria, an ancient city, was a great city because of its diversity, because it drew together all kinds of different sorts of people. We can't do that if we create a housing economy that is choking off housing supply and making it harder for people that already live here and for people that want to be here. This policy simply won't work, guys. It's not going to work. And it's going to make things worse for poor people because the competition for the scarce housing is going to get more intense because there are a lot of people that want to live with us. They want to join us at this bounteous table, this feast that we have in our city. It's a great place to be. And we need poor people, we need rich people, and people in the middle. But we're not going to get that if you continue to willfully believe stuff that just isn't true. And I'm telling you, we need to work together. And right now, Councilmember Sawant and I, the evil developer lobbyist and the great socialist council member, agree that we need to go forward today and use our bonding capacity to build more housing on city-owned land. And yeah, no developer is going to get tarred and feathered if we do that. Is that what you want? Is that what you want? Or do you want more housing? I think what we need is more housing. And she and I together would make a great team in working with the private sector and the city to make them deliver on that promise. Do you agree with that or not?
Okay.
So you would rather support a rent control resolution that will do nothing, that will do absolutely nothing, than go forward with us in collaboration to build more housing on city-owned land. Let the record show, reporters, bloggers, let the record show that the people in this room, not all of you, would rather punish developers than create new housing.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. Councilmember Licata will make his closing statement. 3 minutes.
First of all, those 30,000 subsidized units are subsidized with public funds. And that's what's been happening. The public has been picking up the cost again and again and again. And what's happening is that those people who are building apartments, that's fine, they're making profits, but they're not giving to the public. And many times, they're removing housing from the public, from the market. If you look at the 30,000 subsidized units, there's a 5-year waiting list. We have no rent control, and there's still a 5-year waiting list. Things are not good. Keep in mind the issue that they're debating is that rents should be free of all constraints, should be allowed to have 100% increases. They could displace students, seniors alike. The only restraint should be those who control the rents, would be the property owners. Or the other alternative is the public should be allowed the freedom to direct their democratically elected representatives to rein in the rental market that is controlled by the few that often, unfortunately, take disadvantage of the many. And without restraints, the community as a whole will suffer, and the public will have to pick up the cost to correct the social and economic damages resulting from an uncontrolled and often wild and crazy rental market. And it is crazy. Their solution is to let the public, again, pick up the cost, double the property taxes for picking up larger housing levies. No. We have to, at some point, recognize that, yes, housing levies are good, but we need to have some moderation, some balance. It's not just all one-sided. The council has an opportunity to pass a resolution to ask the state legislature to stop preempting our residents from having the freedom to decide their own economic welfare. Our legislature should be requested to lift the rent control ban to allow us that freedom. And currently, there is a resolution in the Housing Committee, and I've asked the committee chair to bring it to a vote before September 1st. And if that is not the case, then I will take a vote next Monday to introduce another resolution that will go to my committee where we will have a vote. I ask for your support, your involvement. You know what to do. We need to make our government and our economy accountable to the people who live in the city, not those who may live far off and treating us just as figures at the bottom line. Thank you.
Okay, Representative Manweller.
Well, thank you. I want to start off by just saying thank you to the organizers of this event and to everybody who showed up. I love this stuff. I'm a political science professor by trade, and I think that tonight represents, the agora in the way the classic Greeks intended it. People from all over their communities with diverse, strongly held views, debating like hell in an open forum. And I don't even mind the heckling, as long as you can take it as well as you give it. And I don't think I agree with Nick or Kshama on anything, but I would debate them anytime, anywhere. I think it's fun. I think it's good for our democracy. I think it's good for public policy. I guess in order to conclude, whenever you look at issues of should we do this or not, I think the best place is always to start is set aside ideology and look to data, look to history, look to case studies and say, are we the first person to invent this wheel, or will we be reinventing the wheel? And before we do that, let's see what other societies have said. Let's see what other communities have experienced. And I've tried my best to do that tonight by looking at the effects of rent control over the last 60 to 70 years, both globally, both domestically, both here in local places, and said the story is pretty unanimous. It doesn't really matter who you ask or when you ask them. If you ask somebody from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, in Sweden, in France, in New York, Boston, Santa Monica, the story is always the same, and it didn't work. It had unintended consequences that we didn't foresee. In many cases, it made things worse, and so we as a community came together and banned it so that we wouldn't harm people in the future. Regardless of your ideology, whether you put an R or D or an S in front of your name, I think data and facts should matter. And I think that absolutely should matter when you talk about adopting public policy that will affect millions of people that aren't you. When we talk about public policy, it's not just the handful of people up on this stage, but it'll affect, thousands and thousands of other people. So I guess I'll leave you with two rhetorical questions, as we go home tonight and think about this debate. One is, if rent control is such a success, then it seems that San Francisco and New York should be some of the cheapest places to live, since they've had it the longest and have some of the strongest rent control laws. Why is it then that in the cities that have the strongest rent control laws, they have the 2 highest and most expensive places to live in the United States? At least think about that. At least think about that. And the other thing, I guess, is, let me ask you a personal question. What do you own that you think that these 2 people over here should be able to tell you what you can sell it for? Should they be able to tell you what you can sell your car for, your home for, your watch, your iPhone? Maybe they should regulate all the sales that you make. Just ask that question. What do you think they have the right to tell you what you can sell your stuff for?
Thank you. All right. We have our final panelist speaking, Councilmember Sawant. Closing statement, 3 minutes.
I want to start by thanking Mr. Valdez and Representative Manweller for agreeing to debate us. I think it was extremely educational for all of us, and we should have more debates. I agree with them. I also agree with Representative Manweller that data and facts matter. The data and facts show that we need a comprehensive policy package of progressive legislation to allow for affordability in Seattle. Rent control needs to be part of it, not because it will end profits, but it will continue profits, but it will prevent price gouging. And winning anything will take a political fight. No matter which of those progressive legislation we are talking about, it will take a massive fight, because the real estate lobby and big business will fight us tooth and nail, just like they did on $15 an hour. Just to give you a concrete example, Smart Growth Seattle, which is a real estate lobby that Mr. Valdez is the director of, was founded by Blueprint LLC. Blueprint's co-founder is Dan Duffus. Dan Duffus is also the developer who is tearing down a building in West Seattle and is suing the city because he does not want to pay the low-income tenants a relocation assistance of $1,700 per tenant. He just owes them half the relocation assistance. The city pays the other half. Even though he owes such small amounts, he's still suing the city. This means, what does this tell us? This means that they will play hardball no matter how modest a legislation we fight for. So in reality, we have to really gear ourselves up for a major movement, just like we did on 15. And let's see what other societies have said. As was said before, we are not alone in demanding rent regulation and really an addressing of the economic evictions. I mentioned to you the California vote, which was upheld in big numbers. San Mateo County in California is considering rent control. The city of Richmond in California is considering rent control. And Berlin just passed rent control. And the New York City Mayor, de Blasio, has been forced to take a positive position on rent control because that's what his constituents are demanding. So at the end of the day, there is a widespread demand for affordability and livability in our metropolitan areas, and people are not stupid. People understand that progressive legislation is what makes life affordable and livable, and we need to fight for that. I will just end on this point. At the end of the day, you know, we can recite all the facts and the data, but this is a question about vision. What vision do you all have, do we all have for this city? Do we want it to be an enclave for the super wealthy and people who make six-figure salaries only? Then you should definitely not pay attention to what Councilmember Licata and I are saying. But if you want this city to be a vibrant, dynamic, culturally thriving city where we have people of color, where we bring back our black culture, our African-American culture, we bring immigrants and refugees, we have a really livable community, then we will need policies like rent control, and we need your support. Please start by helping us push for the resolution to demand the ban is repealed.